Welcome to Starbound. My name is Aram. I'll be your narrator for today. But before we get into today's story, please check below to see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and just allows our videos to show up on your feed more often.
Humans forbidden from taking part in wars!
Lamore rose from his seat, his yellow eyes boring into Molor before turning to address his fellow officer candidates of the Royal Armada.
This can't be right. It's absurd. You're telling us that in a galactic council with hundreds of species, a single race is prohibited from waging war, and we're supposed to just accept this as fact?
He scoffed incredulously.
This has to be some kind of test. There's no way this lecture is serious.
Molor observed from his slightly raised platform as Lamore and the other two captains in training stared at him, their skepticism thick as cosmic fog in the Academy's smallest lecture chamber. The Lodarian who had spoken remained standing, his purple-tinged fur bristling along his shoulders, yellow eyes narrowed into slits of contempt. Molor studied Lamore carefully, noting how the young Lodarian's long, pointed ears pivoted and strained toward him like weapons finding their mark, how his sleek, muscular tail swished behind him like a metronome counting down his patience. The soon-to-be captain's lean, powerful frame, typical of their feline species, coiled with the same tension Molor had seen in himself in his younger years. His clawed fingertips tapped against his desk's surface, each click a small declaration of defiance. He turned his weathered gaze toward the other two students, his purple-tinged fur dulled with his many cycles.
Captain in Training Logara, Captain in Training Remir, do you share Lamore's doubts about the validity of today's lesson?
The question lingered, unnecessary yet formal. The dark stripes along his face had faded with age, giving his Lodarian features a permanently stern expression. His whiskers quivered slightly, the only outward sign of the amusement he felt at their predictable skepticism.
With respect, Professor Molor,
Logara responded, straightening her slender frame.
It defies all military logic.
Her sleek fur, a lighter shade of lavender than her male counterparts, stiffened as she gestured precisely with one clawed hand.
If humans wish to wage war, what physical force could possibly stop them? Laws are merely constructs. They would simply attack if they desired conflict.
Her yellow eyes narrowed slightly, betraying the calculative processes behind her composed exterior.
I must concur,
added Remir, his voice analytical and cool despite the intensity in his amber gaze. Unlike Lamore's outburst, Remir's objection came wrapped in intellectual clarity.
The premise contradicts fundamental principles of sovereignty and deterrence theory, while Captain Lamore's reaction may be enthusiastic.
Here he paused, his tail flicking once in subtle disapproval.
His core assessment aligns with established doctrines. No species relinquishes its war capabilities without overwhelming force compelling such submission.
Molor absorbed their responses, cataloging each reaction with the seasoned eye of one who had evaluated countless military minds. Lamore, instinctive, passionate, quick to challenge, would make him an excellent tactical commander if he could harness that fire. Logara, methodical, direct, seeing straight paths where others saw none. Her objectivity would serve well in crisis. Remir, the intellectual, seeing patterns and connections, dangerous in his quiet way. All three brilliantly trained, all three utterly ignorant of true horror. Molor felt the old, familiar weight in his chest, the memory of plasma fire raining down on Sector 9, of the human warship that had appeared from nowhere after his squadron had cornered what they thought was a defenseless human transport. Even now, 3 centuries later, he could still hear the screams of his comrades as the humans demonstrated why the galaxy now paid them any price to remain peaceful. Molor took 3 slow steps across the polished obsidian of his teaching platform, the ancient service medals on his formal uniform reflecting the cold light.
You are all correct.
In theory. His voice carried the tone of someone who had seen what theory looked like when it shattered against reality. No species should accept such restrictions. No law alone could enforce it.
Then this entire class is flawed,
Lamore interjected, sinking back into his seat with a triumphant flick of his tail. Don't rush to conclusions. Molor turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the 3 seats arranged in a semicircle before his platform. The chamber was small by Academy standards, designed for specialized instruction rather than general lectures. I said no law alone could enforce it, but what if I told you humans are compensated? Massively compensated. Logara's ears perked forward, a reflexive response she quickly controlled.
Compensated? For not waging war?
Her voice remained steady, but her posture betrayed her intrigue. The carved stone bench beneath her creaked as she leaned forward slightly. Precisely. The Galactic Council provides humans with technology, resources, privileges that no other species receives. Molor reached into his worn service jacket and withdrew a folded document, brittle with age. He carefully unfolded it and turned it toward them. These are the annual tributes, though we don't officially call them that, provided to human colonies and their central government. Ramir's amber eyes widened as he scanned the numbers. His tail, usually kept in perfect stillness, twitched once. This can't be correct. These figures would bankrupt multiple sectors. And yet, every cycle, we pay. Molor's tone hardened. The council determined it was cheaper than the alternative.
What alternative?
Lamore asked, his earlier defiance diminishing beneath a growing unease. Molor stepped to the edge of his platform, looking down at his students from the mere 30 centimeters of elevation that somehow felt like a mountain between their experience and his. Rebuilding after human wars, counting our dead, being remembered only in memorial archives. A heavy silence filled the chamber. The air circulation system made noise in the background, the only sound as the 3 students exchanged glances.
You believe humans are that dangerous?
Logara stated, not a question, but an attempt to reconcile the absurdity of what they were hearing with the evident seriousness of their professor. I don't believe it. Molor's eyes grew distant. I survived it. I know they are. The question isn't whether humans are dangerous. The question is, why are they forbidden from fighting our wars? And the answer... He paused, his gaze sharpening on each of them in turn. The answer is that humans don't fight wars the way we do. They don't have natural weapons like our claws, or instinctive hunting behaviors. They had to invent every aspect of warfare, and when a species has to invent killing rather than evolve with it, they approach it differently. Silence lingered as Molor's words settled over the 3 students. After a moment, Lamore's defiant posture returned, but before he could speak, Molor raised a weathered hand. Before any of you can throw your sharp questions at me, let me tell you a story, he said, his voice dropping to a tone that immediately commanded attention. He stepped down from his platform, an unprecedented break from Academy protocol, and moved to stand directly before his students. 3 centuries ago, I wasn't Professor Molor. I was Cadet Molor, fresh from this very academy, assigned to the Saraxis campaign. His eyes took on a distant quality. Our people had claimed colonial rights to Saraxis 4, a habitable moon for species like ours. Humans had already established a small observation post there before us, but by all recognized territorial protocols, the moon should have been ours.
Observation posts can often become permanent settlements if left unchallenged, Ramir noted. Precisely why we acted, Molor acknowledged before continuing. The Council did what it always does in these situations. Restricted the conflict to ground forces, declared winner takes all based on who could hold territory. I was part of the third deployment wave, so proud in my new uniform, so certain of victory.
He stopped pacing and looked at each student in turn.
I remember stepping off the transport, that first breath of Syrax's air, sulfur-laden and acrid with weapon discharge. Our unit disembarked in usual formation, just as we'd trained. I checked my equipment 3 times during descent, sharpened my claws to perfection for the glorious close combat I was certain awaited me.
Lamore nodded with understanding.
The pre-deployment rituals, we still practice them.
Some traditions are hard to get rid of,
Molor replied.
The forward base wasn't what I expected. No ceremonial greetings. No formation of veterans standing at attention to welcome fresh troops. Just silence and watching eyes. Eyes that had seen something they couldn't explain.
Molor's tail, normally kept perfectly still during lectures, swayed slightly with the rhythm of his words.
A veteran approached our commander, missing half an ear, fur matted with dried blood he hadn't bothered to clean. Put the ceremonial blades away, he said. They're worse than useless here. Our commander reminded him about honor and protocol. The veteran just stared at him, then walked away without another word.
What did he mean by worse than useless?
Logara asked, leaning forward slightly.
That we wouldn't get a chance to use it in battle, Molor answered. That night at the base, I couldn't sleep. Everything felt wrong. The veterans moved differently than we'd been taught. They spoke in whispers, if at all. The perimeter guards didn't follow standard rotation patterns. They moved randomly, erratically. Patterns get you killed, a 2-week veteran told me when I asked. Humans learn patterns.
Adaptive targeting, Ramir murmured.
We studied it in advanced tactics. You study theory, Molor corrected. They perfected practice. He continued. The next morning, I saw my first human casualty. A scout team brought in a body. I'd expected to feel triumph, but instead I felt confusion. They looked so fragile. No natural weapons, no armor. Just soft pink skin in dark clothing. I couldn't understand how these creatures were making hardened Lodarian warriors speak in whispers.
Molor's voice took on a clinical detachment, as though the emotional distance was necessary to continue.
Over the next weeks, I learned why. Humans don't fight to establish dominance. They don't seek honor. They fight exclusively to win, using any means available. When we deployed in standard formations, they attacked from unexpected angles. When we secured perimeters according to doctrine, they bypassed them entirely to strike supply lines. When we adapted to their night ambushes, they switched to attacking during the harshest daylight hours when we were tired of keeping our vigilance.
He leaned against the edge of his desk, his formal posture momentarily abandoned as the tone of his voice alone kept the 3 students silent.
Things were harsh, but winning didn't seem impossible. By the 6th week, Command declared the campaign a success. We controlled 60% of the habitable surface. News was transmitted to Homeworld. Celebrations began. He gave a short, humorless laugh. We later discovered the humans had been retreating in calculated waves, deliberately drawing more of our forces to the surface. A trap, Logara said flatly.
Molor nodded.
I was inspecting a forward position when it happened. The sky lit up like a solar flare. The ground, solid rock, rippled beneath my feet like water. The heat. His voice faltered for the first time. The heat was beyond description. The classroom was utterly silent. Even Lamore sat transfixed. They called it a kinetic bombardment system. Nothing that violated Council weapons protocols. No radiation, no energy signatures. Just balls of metal dropped from orbit. Simple, crude chunks of metal. But at that velocity, hitting the surface. Molor's hands trembled slightly, an involuntary reaction he didn't attempt to hide. I remember the shockwave lifting me. Then, nothing. I woke up 3 days later in the Council medical facility. 70% of my body had been burned away. The medical officer told me later that only the Council's most advanced healing technology had saved me. Technology that had been rapidly developed after seeing what human weapons could do to living tissue. His voice grew even quieter. From our deployment of 14,000 Lodarians, 212 survived. Most with injuries that would have been fatal a generation earlier. 7 precisely targeted strikes. They eliminated our forces while leaving 90% of the moon's surface intact. They had colonists moving in within a month. Molor fell silent, his tale complete. The classroom remained quiet for several moments before Lamore shifted in his seat. "Professor," Lamore began, his voice lacking its earlier defiance but still resolute. "While that was disturbing, I still don't understand why humans would be banned from all warfare. They broke the rules of engagement by using orbital strikes in what was supposed to be an infantry-only conflict. Couldn't the Council simply enforce stricter protocols?" Ramir nodded in agreement. "It seems strange to exclude an entire species from military action because of one violation, however severe." Molor's eyes narrowed. "You still don't understand." He placed both palms on the desk before him. "To humans, the Council's rules didn't matter at the time. From their perspective, we had attacked their colony and still had the audacity to want to dictate how they could defend it." "But rules of engagement exist precisely to prevent total warfare," Logara countered. "Every species agrees to certain limitations." "Every species except humans," Molor replied. "At least, not them. To them, our rules seemed arbitrary and self-serving, designed to favor our natural advantages while neutralizing theirs. They saw no honor in accepting constraints imposed by the very people trying to take their territory." Lamore's tail flicked with frustration. "Then the logical response would be to strike harder, not create an entirely new class of galactic citizens with special privileges." A shadow of something, was it fear, crossed Molor's features. "The way you think is logic, Lamore. The Council tried that approach first." He moved back around his desk, his gaze distant once more. "After the Saraxis incident, the Council issued formal censures and penalties against the human territories. When those were ignored, they decided to send a demonstration. The strongest military species in the quadrant was dispatched to teach humans a lesson about why galactic rules existed." The 3 students exchanged glances. This wasn't in any of their historical texts. "The Karathi," Ramir said softly, making the connection. "But they're nearly extinct now," Molor finished for him. "Yes." He adjusted his uniform, his expression grim. "Perhaps you'd like to hear that story next, about the Council's attempt to force its will on humans instead of paying them to remain peaceful." The 3 students sat in stunned silence.
Molor moved back to his platform, but didn't step up onto it. Instead, he leaned against its edge, his weathered frame suddenly looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with age.
By the time of the Karathi incident, he began, I was no longer a cadet. I had risen to captain my own vessel, the Void Observer, a scout-class ship with a crew of 26.
His eyes took on that distant quality again.
Command considered me uniquely qualified for the assignment. Perspective, they called it. As one of the few survivors of Syraxis, they believed I could provide value.
Molor's tail swayed gently as he settled into his story.
We were tasked with monitoring the Korathi operation from a safe distance. The Council had grown tired of human disregard for galactic protocols. After the Syraxis incident, sanctions had been imposed. Trade restrictions, technology embargoes. The humans ignored them all. They continued expanding their colonies, developing their own technology paths. To the Council, this defiance was intolerable.
He crossed his arms, his claws absently tracing old scars visible even through his fur.
The Korathi were chosen deliberately. 4-limbed warriors, naturally armored, with neural networks that allowed them to coordinate their forces with unparalleled accuracy. Their exoskeletons could withstand vacuum and pressure extremes that would crush most species.
Logara shifted slightly in her seat.
We studied them in extinct civilizations. The texts say they suffered a catastrophic population decline, but never why.
Molor nodded grimly.
History is written carefully when the lessons are uncomfortable.
He continued without further acknowledgement of her comment.
The Korathi plan was simple. Seize Earth's moon, humanity's oldest and most symbolically important colony. Not to keep it, but to demonstrate that humans were not beyond the Council's reach. To teach them that defiance had consequences.
He began to pace slowly, the rhythm of his steps matching the cadence of his words.
My ship took position in the shadow of Mars, close enough to observe, but beyond detection range. The Korathi arrived with typical arrogance. 47 battleships, each carrying thousands of warriors, emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. And then, they did something no species would have considered wise after Syraxis.
Molor paused, his ears flattening.
They announced their intentions. From the moment they entered real space, they broadcast on all frequencies. We claim this moon for the Korathi Empire as punishment for human transgressions against galactic law. Evacuate or be removed.
Ramir's analytical mind engaged immediately.
They warned them, after what happened at Syraxis. Arrogance, Molor replied simply. The Korathi had never lost a military engagement in 2,000 years. They wanted humans to know who was coming and why. They expected fear, perhaps negotiation. They received neither.
His voice took on a clinical detachment, as though reciting a field report.
The initial phase proceeded as expected. Korathi forces overwhelmed the lunar defenses within hours. Their neural-linked battle coordination was magnificent to witness, even from our observation position. Human defensive platforms were disabled one after the other. Their patrol ships were driven back to Earth orbit. By all tactical assessments, the operation was proceeding flawlessly.
Molor's eyes narrowed as he recalled the events.
Then, something changed. Our sensors detected massive ships taking off from Earth's surface, not from their military installations, but from civilian power facilities, manufacturing centers, even residential sectors. Every human nation, entities that had fought each other viciously throughout their history, suddenly coordinated their response.
They united?
Lamore asked, his earlier skepticism completely gone. As I told my first officer at the time, trust me, That was not a small thing, Molor replied. Their historical records show centuries of bitter conflicts between their nation-states. Yet, faced with the Korathi, ancient enemies pooled resources, shared technology, and combined their forces under unified command. His pace quickened slightly as the story intensified. The battle that followed defied all strategic models. Human ships, smaller, less armored, seemingly outmatched, began employing tactics that violated every principle of space warfare. They sacrificed vessels to draw Korathi forces into specific configurations. They used their own damaged ships as weapons. When the Korathi adapted to one approach, humans would immediately shift to another. Molor's normally controlled voice grew more animated. For 6 days, we watched the conflict escalate. The space between Earth and its moon became a graveyard of ships from both sides. The Korathi, for the first time in their history, found themselves in a battle they couldn't decisively win. The casualties mounted. Their neural network became overwhelmed with defensive calculations. He stopped pacing and looked directly at his students. On this 7th day, the Korathi Supreme Commander made a fatal miscalculation. With 30% of their fleet destroyed and no clear path to victory, they decided the lesson had been sufficiently delivered. They began withdrawing their forces in coordinated waves. Molor's voice dropped to a near whisper. To the Korathi, it was a strategic redeployment. To humans, it was their first opportunity to seize momentum. They didn't pursue immediately, not directly. Instead, they allowed the first withdrawal waves to escape while positioning their forces along the likely retreat vectors. He shook his head slowly. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a hunt. The Korathi, bound by their rigid command structure, couldn't respond to the human pursuit tactics. Their careful withdrawal became a desperate retreat, then a rout. After so many casualties, the humans didn't just want victory. They wanted annihilation. Surely the Korathi surrendered when defeat became inevitable, Ramir suggested. Molor gave him a look that silenced further comment. The Korathi had never surrendered in their history. Their genetic and cultural programming didn't include that option. And the humans, to them, after so much destruction, there was no middle ground. The Korathi had come to their home, threatened their oldest colony, killed thousands of their people. In human thinking, this wasn't just a conflict over territory. It was existential. His tale had gone completely still, a sign of deep discomfort among Lodarians. The pursuit lasted for months. The humans followed retreating Korathi vessels back to their staging areas, then to their outlying colonies, and finally to their homeworld. At each point, the Korathi expected the humans to declare victory and withdraw to avoid further losses. At each point, they were wrong. Molor's voice had grown hollow. When it ended, the Korathi civilization, which had dominated galactic military affairs for 2 millennia, was reduced to a protected species on a single reservation world. Their population declined from billions to fewer than 6 million. The classroom fell into complete silence. To this day, no one knows if the near extinction of the Korathi resulted from their too proud to surrender culture, or the humans' relentless ability to carry out extended campaigns. What is clear is that what began as a lesson for humans became instead a lesson for the rest of the galaxy. Nothing good ever comes from fighting humans. Molor finally stepped back onto his platform, reclaiming some of his professorial demeanor.
Is this how humans were forbidden from joining wars?
Asked Lamore. The Korathi incident should have been enough, yet it wasn't. Lamore, who had begun the class with such defiance, now leaned forward with visible interest.
Then how did it happen, Professor?
Logara nodded, her serious gaze giving way to genuine curiosity as she checked her datapad.
Why are the historical records vague about the events leading to the Human Exemption Treaty?
Even Ramir's tale betrayed his anticipation, swishing gently against his chair.
If 2 incidents of this magnitude weren't enough to convince the Council, what could humans possibly have done to finally secure such an unprecedented legal status?
Molor observed the 3 students, future captains of the Royal Armada, with a mix of satisfaction and solemnity. Their earlier skepticism had transformed into a hunger to understand. It was precisely the shift in perspective he had hoped to achieve.
That,
he said, settling into his chair,
brings us to the Proxima incident, and unlike the previous events, I wasn't merely an observer. I was at the very center of the decision that would forever change how the galaxy approached humanity.
Molor's weathered features took on a gravity the students hadn't yet seen, even through his earlier stories. This wasn't just a memory. This was something he carried with him every day.
In the year following the Korathi collapse, he began, the galaxy changed. Fear spread faster than any plague. Species that had maintained neutrality for millennia began building warships. Trade routes shifted to avoid human space. The council chambers echoed with demands for action before humans expanded further.
He rose from his chair again, moving to the small window that overlooked the academy grounds where young officers trained in perfect formations.
My name became prominent during this time. The survivor of Saraxis, the witness to Korathi decimation. I was summoned to brief the High Council repeatedly, to explain what I had seen, to help them understand what we faced.
A bitter smile crossed his face.
Suddenly, my scars became political currency. My nightmares became strategic intelligence.
Lamore tilted his head slightly.
Is that how you became Fleet Admiral? I've read that position hadn't existed for 7 centuries before you.
Indeed,
Molor nodded.
The galaxy created new hierarchies out of fear. Old rivalries were set aside. Species that had never cooperated suddenly found common cause. In less than a standard year, I went from commanding a scout vessel to overseeing what we now call the Cleansing Fleet, the largest military force ever assembled.
How many vessels? Ramir asked, his analytical mind clearly trying to quantify the scale.
At its peak, over 17,000 capital ships,
plus support vessels, Molor replied.
Every militarized species contributed. Some emptied their defense forces entirely. The combined fleet mass was visible from planetary surfaces as shadow patterns during daylight. We blocked stars.
Logara leaned forward.
Surely the humans knew what was happening. A mobilization of that scale couldn't be concealed.
Of course they knew. Molor's ears flattened. That was perhaps our first miscalculation, believing surprise was possible. Human intelligence networks had penetrated most council species to depths we still don't fully understand. They monitored our shipyards, tracked our fleet movements, even infiltrated early planning sessions.
He turned back to face his students.
By the time we marshaled our forces, they had already begun their preparations. Not for defense, for exodus.
They fled?
Lamore's voice carried disbelief. A strategic withdrawal, Molor corrected. When our unified fleet approached their homeworld, Earth, we encountered only minimal resistance. Their orbital defenses engaged us briefly, then self-destructed once we were within a certain range. A tactic we would come to recognize all too well. Molor's voice took on the measured cadence of a military briefing, though his tale betrayed agitation as he continued.
We found their planet largely evacuated. Their population had dispersed to their colonies and to ships they had acquired from the Korathi. From orbit, Earth appeared inhabited. It took us 3 days to confirm it was essentially abandoned.
He paced slowly before his students.
I remember standing on the bridge of my command ship, watching the first landing parties securing Earth's surface. I felt victorious. After Syraxis, after watching the Korathi fall, I believed I had accomplished something unprecedented, forcing humans to abandon their cradle world without a devastating battle. Molor paused, his gaze distant. I was a fool. That wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. The classroom fell silent as Molor's voice dropped lower. What followed was not warfare as any species understood it. The humans dispersed throughout the galaxy, operating from mobile bases, abandoned mining facilities, even from within asteroid fields. They never engaged our main fleet directly. Instead, they targeted our supply lines, communication relays, isolated outposts. He gestured with his hands as he described the tactics. They developed stealth ships that could approach a military installation, deploy infiltration teams, and depart without triggering defensive systems. They perfected hit-and-run tactics on a scale no one had imagined possible. A coalition outpost would report normal status, then go silent permanently minutes later.
How did they coordinate? Ramir asked.
That was another revelation, Molor replied. They didn't have a centralized command structure as we understood it. Their forces operated with broad strategic guidance, but near complete tactical autonomy. When we intercepted and decoded their communications, we found not detailed orders, but general principles, shared intelligence, and suggested targets. Molor's claws absently traced patterns on his desk. And they were patient. They didn't attempt to reclaim Earth immediately. Instead, they methodically targeted Council member worlds, not with overwhelming force, but with precision strikes designed to instill maximum fear with minimum resources. His voice grew harsher. They weaponized terror in ways that still haunt strategic planning. A governor who advocated strong anti-human measures would find a small human device in their private quarters. Not activated, simply placed where it couldn't be missed. A message: we can reach you anywhere. The students sat transfixed as Molor continued. They mastered psychological warfare too. They identified which species in our coalition were most susceptible to fear or doubt. They would spare ships from those worlds during engagements, while destroying vessels from more resolute species. The message was clear. Your allies are the reason you're dying, not us. Molor's ears flattened completely against his skull. Soon we faced not just external attacks, but internal fracturing. Security protocols tightened to paranoid levels. Species began accusing each other of secret deals with humans. Coalition meetings that once focused on strategy devolved into accusations and recriminations.
And you were at the center of it all, Logara observed quietly.
Yes. The single word carried volumes of weight. Fleet Admiral Molor, the great defender of galactic civilization. With each passing month, my authority expanded, while my actual control diminished. I commanded the most powerful fleet ever assembled, yet I had no target to shoot. He gave a humorless laugh. I lived on my command ship, surrounded by the most sophisticated security systems available. I slept an average of 2 hours per cycle. Every decision I made was scrutinized by council members safe in their distant chambers. Every tactical failure was laid at my feet, while any successes were claimed by whatever council species had contributed the vessels involved. The bitterness in his voice was undisguised now. The worst were the explosives. Humans identified species with similar appearances to themselves. There are several with minor differences. They would approach these individuals, usually on vulnerable outer colonies, and offer simple choices. Carry a package into a secured area. Sometimes they didn't even need threats, just credits or technology. Molor's voice grew hollow. 3 separate coalition leadership summits, ended in explosions. 2 planetary governors assassinated. 1 council member's entire family was eliminated during what should have been a secure vacation. All while I received reports of growing civil unrest on a dozen worlds as the conflict stretched from months into years.
His tale had gone completely still, a sign of the deepest distress in Lodarians. 4 years after we secured Earth, the coalition was fracturing. Military budgets were collapsing economies. Populations were questioning whether the human threat justified the sacrifices. Meanwhile, human strikes grew more precise, more devastating. They weren't trying to defeat us militarily. They were breaking our will to continue. Molor fell silent for a moment, gathering himself. The students waited, not daring to interrupt. What few knew then, what is still classified in most historical archives, is that I advocated for rendering Earth uninhabitable. All 3 students stiffened in shock. Yes, Molor acknowledged their reaction. I formally recommended deploying forbidden weapons to transform Earth's atmosphere, making it permanently unsuitable for human habitation. My reasoning was that humans had demonstrated they would never stop fighting while their homeworld remained intact, even if unoccupied. By destroying what they were fighting to reclaim, we might end the conflict. His voice grew distant. The council debated my recommendation for 17 days. Species aligned into factions. Arguments became threats. Meanwhile, 3 more coalition bases were destroyed by human strikes. He looked directly at his students. Before the council could reach a decision, I received a coded transmission, not from my superiors, but from a human commander. Molor's voice grew very quiet. They had intercepted my recommendation. They knew exactly what I had proposed. The message contained only coordinates and time. After 4 years of pursuing shadows, they were offering a direct meeting.
It was a trap,
Lamore said with certainty. That was my first thought as well, Molor agreed. But attached to the message was detailed intelligence about an imminent coup attempt against the council leadership. Information we verified as accurate within hours. The humans had given us actionable intelligence as what? A gesture of good faith? A demonstration of their capabilities? I'm still not certain. He shook his head slowly. What I discovered later was that while I had been fighting their forces across the galaxy, humans had been conducting separate, secret negotiations with individual council members. Species were making private arrangements, securing promises of non-aggression in exchange for territorial concessions, technology transfers, even cultural exchanges. They bypassed you entirely, Ramir observed. Worse than that, Molor replied. They used me as the alternative, an example of spending a lot and achieving nothing. Their diplomatic overtures carried an implicit threat. Deal with us now on these terms, or continue following Admiral Molor toward a war without end that might culminate in Earth's destruction, which would only ensure human vengeance for generations to come. His voice carried decades of resignation. When I arrived at the coordinates, I found not just human representatives, but delegates from 7 council species. They had already drafted what would become the Human Exemption Treaty. They needed only the military authority I represented to make it complete. Molor looked at each student in turn. The coalition I had spent 4 years holding together had negotiated its own dissolution behind my back. The war I had dedicated my life to winning was being settled through terms I had no part in creating.
The silence that followed Molor's account was profound. The classroom seemed smaller somehow, as though the weight of history had compressed the space between them. Ramir was the first to speak. So the human exemption treaty wasn't punishment. It was appeasement. A crude term, but not entirely inaccurate, Molor acknowledged. The treaty had 3 core provisions. Humans would be exempt from all interspecies conflicts. They would receive substantial resource allocations from all Council worlds, and in exchange, they would restrict their military activities to their own territories.
And they agreed to these terms?
Lamore asked, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved.
After fighting so fiercely to reclaim their homeworld?
Molor nodded slowly. They did, for a reason the Council hadn't anticipated. Humans fight external threats with singular focus and unity, but without such threats, he trailed off. Logara leaned forward, her analytical mind making the connection.
They turn that focus inward.
Precisely, Molor confirmed. The one advantage we discovered. Too late to use militarily, but perfectly suited for a diplomatic solution, was that humans are far more contentious among themselves than any other sapient species. Without external enemies, they fragment into competing factions, arguing endlessly about resource allocation, technological development paths, cultural priorities. He moved to stand directly before his students, looking deep into their eyes. The treaty gave them everything they wanted materially, but it also removed the one thing that had united them, a common enemy. Within a decade of the treaty signing, human political entities had splintered into dozens of competing factions.
So we pay them to fight each other instead of us,
Ramir said, distilling the strategy to its essence. We pay them to remain peaceful, Molor corrected gently. How they manage their internal affairs is their concern. But yes, the resources we provide have become the focus of their disputes rather than territory or military dominance. Their energy is directed inward, not outward. Lamore shook his head in disbelief.
And this is why you teach this course, to explain this arrangement?
I teach this course, Molor said carefully, because someone must ensure the lesson is not forgotten. After the treaty was implemented, the Council offered me a choice. Accept a ceremonial advisory position with no actual authority, or take a role training the next generation of officers. His gaze moved between the 3 students. I chose to teach because history is dangerous when sanitized. The official records describe the human exemption as a mutual non-aggression pact, or a specialized legal status. They don't explain why it exists, or what preceded it.
You want us to fear humans,
Logara observed. I want you to understand them, Molor countered. Fear without understanding leads to poor decisions, like those the Council made before the treaty. Understanding without appropriate caution is equally dangerous. He returned to his platform, resuming his formal professorial stance. Each of you will soon command vessels that will traverse human territories. You will encounter their traders, diplomats, and civilian ships. You must understand what lies beneath their current peaceful interactions with our kind. Is that why only 3 students are selected for this course each cycle? Ramir asked. To limit knowledge of the true history? No, Molor replied. 3 students are selected because you 3 will command the vessels responsible for delivering the resource shipments mandated by the treaty. Your assignments aren't coincidental. They're specifically designed to place our most promising officers in regular contact with humans under controlled, peaceful circumstances. Lamore's tail flicked with sudden understanding.
We're being evaluated on how we process this information.
Indeed, Molor nodded. An officer who responds with hatred or unnecessary fear toward humans would be problematic in your future role. Equally dangerous would be one who fails to appreciate the seriousness of maintaining the treaty terms exactly as specified. He straightened to his full height. Many within the council resent the resources allocated to humans. They consider it extortion, an indignity to superior species. What those critics fail to understand is that what we provide costs us less annually than a single day of the war consumed at its height. Molor's gaze swept across his three students one final time. The human exemption treaty is not an ideal solution. It may not even be just one, but it is effective. After centuries of implementation, we have confirmed one essential truth. Humans are infinitely more manageable as subsidized allies than as committed enemies. And that, future captains, is worth every rare element, every technological concession, and every diplomatic accommodation we provide.